stepmom and her brother, and spend some time with friends. Some of our best friends drove down and spent time with us, so that was great. I love serving a church that really listens. On Sunday, I guess I got back to the house, and my son said one of the guys in the church came by with a Wade Boggs card, a baseball card, and $5 tucked in the back because he forgot to put his $5 in the plate. And he said, that will help you next time somebody begs. You've got $5 to be able to give away. I thought that was great. Sunday was a wonderful day. How many of you know about our ESL ministry, our English as a Second Language? Okay, just a few of you. We have an English as a Second Language group. If you'd like to help, they're always looking for conversation partners. There are two women who had a passion for this, and now a third young woman has come along, and she has expertise in this. She's worked at the CDC and has expertise and a real passion for this. And the three of them have really amped up that program. They bring people to church on Sundays. They have Bible study as well as English as a Second Language. And two of the people from our English as a Second Language group, this young man is a doctor from Korea. He's got a PhD in material science. He's about to launch a startup. If anybody has some venture capital, I know he'd be glad to talk to them. But he's working in the thrombosis and medical device lab there. And they have discovered church and came and wanted to get baptized. And so I had the privilege of baptizing he and his wife this past Sunday, all because of our English as a Second Language group. We had 8 new members Sunday, which is pretty wonderful. One more member of my staff has decided to join the church, and I think that's a great tribute to the church that people who work here want to also be members of the church. And one of those new members was Cameron Curry. So Cameron and his wife Margie, so welcome. We're glad that you're here. And we would have had 10, but Scott and his wife had been traveling. So Scott and Kim Wolf will be some of our newest members. I know you thought Scott was a member, but this group has done a great deal of work to help Scott and his wife find their place here at Dunwoody. So we look forward to welcome you officially, but you're as active as any of some of our members. So we're glad, and he even brought breakfast this morning before he even joined the church. So that is a good thing. How many of y'all have been to one of our neighborhood gatherings? Okay, that's a good start. I know some of you are hosting neighborhood gatherings, have already hosted neighborhood gatherings, and I'm thankful for that. We have 56 or 57, Eric tells me, neighborhood gatherings, and those will have at least 10 people. So there'll be over 600 people in our church who've gotten together and will get to know their neighbors. And what I love about it is Fran and his wife, Mary, invited neighbors who were visiting the church and next door neighbors who've been to the church once. And that just is a wonderful thing that people who are getting connected. And then I got a text yesterday asking me to come specifically to one of the neighborhood gatherings because one of our young couples has invited all their neighbors, especially those who are looking for churches, and they want me to meet them. So they said, please come to our neighborhood gathering, and I'm going to work hard to be able to get there. I think it's the night of the Summit Gala, so I may not be at the Summit Gala. I may be at a neighborhood gathering. I'm appreciative to Pat for teaching Purpose Driven Life. It was a book that changed the life of my last church. I had just gotten there. It was I got there in July of 2021. And then what happened? July of 2001. Yes, 9/11. And a lot of people came back to church looking to be connected to something. And many churches didn't retain those people who came searching, but somehow we were able to retain those people. And one of the things that helped us to do that was Purpose Driven Life. I was not going to use it. I was not going to teach it because it has a Calvinist bent. And one of my buddies looked at me and he said, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You need to teach Purpose-Driven Life from a Wesleyan perspective. And I said, okay, let's see how that worked. And I said, I will teach it and you can be in my class as long as you agree to teach it to someone else or host a gathering of it in your home. And we launched 45 new small groups over the next month of people who took it from me and met someone, someone like Pat's like, I'll teach it, but I don't want to host it in my home. And Scott was like, well, I'll host it in my home. I don't want to teach it. And the two of them partnered up. We started 45 small groups. One of them still meets. And that's how many years ago? Almost 25 years ago. One group of women who got together in that still meets together. It was life-changing for people. It was life-changing for our church. And I taught it. I taught it on Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Tuesday mornings to my staff, Wednesday morning and Wednesday nights. I taught 5 classes for the 40 days leading up to it. And then the whole church did it for 40 days. And it was quite the endeavor. So, but in response to that, I had an associate pastor who was also our youth minister, and he fancied himself a writer. And he started writing and started doing less work for me. And I finally went to him one day and I said, "You're not really helping me. You're doing less and less work." And he said, "Yeah, I've started writing and I made enough money to make a car payment. And then I made enough money to make a house payment. And now I'm making more than I'm making with you." And I said, "Well, you really are distracted. You need to go do something else." And so he did. And now he writes for a living. And one of the books he wrote was a tribute to me and Gail on the staff here, called Zombie Driven Life. So he did a parody on that. It's selling like hotcakes. I know. I think they give it away on Amazon. But so maybe the next study you do is Zombie Driven Life. Today we look at the Transfiguration. It's one of my favorite passages because of my experience with it as a pastor. I used to train other pastors, and especially young pastors, in leadership and how to run their churches. And we had a retreat almost every February to kind of launch things and get these pastors to know each other. And we would go away up into the mountains, usually at Camp Glisten, and I would have speakers come in. And because they were taking 3 or 4 days to get together, I wanted them to have preparation for their Lenten sermon series. So we asked the first person to preach on the Transfiguration. We asked the second person to preach on the temptation, the first Sunday in Lent. We asked the third person to preach on the second Sunday in Lent, and we thought this would really be helpful. But because it was the week of Transfiguration Sunday, the first speaker got up and he preached on the Transfiguration. The second person came in and said, "I know I'm supposed to talk about temptation, but God's called me to talk about Transfiguration." And all 5 speakers that week spoke about the Transfiguration instead of what they were supposed to speak on. And then I got up to close things out. And the young woman who was running the whole thing, she said, "Okay, you're going to do the last Sunday in Lent." And I got up and I said, "No, I think I'll do the Transfiguration." So it's one of my favorite passages. I hope that it will become yours at some point. So Transfiguration, it really is the hinge between, see if I got this. Is that me or you? Is the hinge between Epiphany and Lent. We've had a series called Jesus Said What, dealing with some of the more difficult sayings of Jesus and the difficult calling that Jesus has on our lives. And there's one Sunday between that series, the first Sunday in March, and the beginning of Lent. And I always hate it when people miss the opportunity to remind people that after this Sunday, Lent starts on Wednesday. You can't wait to the first Sunday in Lent to start your Lenten discipline. Your Lenten discipline starts a week from tomorrow. So I want you to start thinking about what your Lenten discipline might be. This is the final Epiphany. This is the final appearance of God in our scriptures for Epiphany. It's really the end of Epiphany, and God's voice shows up again, because there are bookends of Epiphany. We began our journey at the beginning of the year with what story? Does anybody remember? First Sunday of the year, usually? Baptism of the Lord. And in the baptism of the Lord, you hear from God, and God speaks from the cloud. God speaks from heaven. And when Jesus is coming up out of the water from baptism, the voice of the Lord is heard, and the voice says this. Let's read it together. "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And I often say, as men, that's something we long for to hear, depending on our relationship with our dad. Even if our relationship with our dad is very good, it's something that we long to hear. You are my son. the beloved. With you, I am well pleased. And some people spend their whole lives trying to live into that. Jesus has just gone through temptation, which I'll preach about in the next week, which kind of seems out of order, but it's the way we always begin Lent, is with dealing with temptation. And Jesus it has been baptized and then deals with temptation. So he needs to hear from God that you are my son, you are my beloved, and with you I am well pleased. And in that, he has the strength to deal with temptation. And then this is what happens in this passage, and let's read that together. This is my son, the chosen, my chosen, listen to him. And so the language is a little bit different in Luke, and we're going to see the differences between Mark, Matthew, and Luke here today. But there also are bookends of the Transfiguration. So we have bookends of Epiphany with the voice from the cloud, God speaking. There's another time where God speaks audibly in the New Testament that isn't through Jesus, but is in the Gospel of John. But here in the Synoptic Gospels, the same I-Gospels, there are these two times when it happens. And yet they're bookends of the Transfiguration as well. They're things that happen just before and just after the Transfiguration. And it is Jesus' passion prediction. Now, that's the way we talk about it as pastors, as theologians. But when I say the passion prediction, what that really means is Jesus is telling us he's going to die. He's telling his disciples he's going to die, and he's trying to make them comfortable with his death and their death. And I think that people are very uncomfortable with death. I'm planning a funeral. I've been working with two different families this week to plan funerals. And one of the daughters of one of the families said, "Oh my goodness, I can't even think about my own funeral." I was like, "You're 70. You might want to be thinking about your funeral." And she said, "I can't even begin to talk about it." But her parent was so comfortable doing that her parent laid out all of the things that they wanted for that funeral, what scripture they wanted, what songs they wanted, what they wanted me to say, even brought me over to the house to tell me things he wanted me to say. And I think that's a very mature place in faith. And it was interesting just how difficult it was for her to think about death. And Jesus says it twice, before the Transfiguration and after the Transfiguration. Peter has made his confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus says to them, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." And many of the disciples are thinking to themselves, this is not what we signed on for. We didn't sign on for you to go to Jerusalem to die. We signed on for you to go to Jerusalem and fix things, to go in and turn over the tables and fix things, not to go and die. And they push back because that's not what they want to hear. And then Jesus goes up to the mountaintop. And as I said, everything goes downhill from there. Literally, it goes uphill, but literarily, it goes downhill. Because literally, they're heading up to Jerusalem. Jesus in 9:51 sets his face to go to Jerusalem and resolutely will not turn back after Luke 9:51. So it's literally uphill, but literarily downhill. And then after this, he says, when everyone was amazed at all that he was doing, he said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears." Because he's tried to tell them before that he's going to die, and they don't want to hear it. Let these words sink in. The Son of Man's going to be betrayed into human hands. But they didn't understand this saying. Its meaning remained concealed from them, so they could not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. Steve Jobs said it very well. Remembering that you're going to die is the best way to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There's no reason not to follow your heart. And yet Steve Jobs gave us the greatest temptation in the world, which you've just picked up. The greatest temptation in the world, the bite out of the apple. I think, it's a bite out of an apple for a reason. And people can't let these go. They have a better relationship with their phones than they do with the people in their family. And you can trace the advent of teen suicide, of young women's depression, to the advent of the iPhone. There's a great book about it by a professor from one of the California schools, where she talks about it. She even has a YouTube video where she talks about how the iPhone begins the downfall of part of our society and creates all this anxiety, especially in teenage girls. And so it is kind of like things are going downhill. Jesus says, I'm headed toward Jerusalem. And we've just had this action-packed chapter 9. Everything happens in chapter 9. If you hadn't read Luke chapter 9, go and read that this week. Everything happens. I mean, it's like one thing after another. He gives the 12 a mission. Herod's confused about this. He feeds the 5,000. Peter declares, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus foretells his death and resurrection. And this is just the first 20 verses. I mean, we're just getting started in Luke chapter 9, and then we get to these verses in Luke 9, the Transfiguration. Over and over again in the Gospel of Luke and in other Gospels, Jesus takes away a small group in order to teach them and reveal God's glory to them in a way that other people don't get to see. Chapter before, Jairus' daughter needs to be healed, and who does Jesus take with him? Peter, James, and John. I always complained he never took Philip. I mean, always Peter, James, and John, but Philip doesn't get to go. Philip's stuck at the bottom of the mountain. Philip's stuck outside, but Peter, James, and John always get to go. And so I asked Jesus, I said, Jesus, why don't you invite me? And he's like, we already have a foursome. We don't need you. You ever felt like you were on the outside of a foursome? I mean, that's just how it goes sometimes. Well, here are these words from Luke, the 9th chapter. Now, 8 days after these sayings, which sayings? The declaration about his death, and also Peter's declaration of who Jesus is. After these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, not Philip, okay? Not Thomas, right? Just Peter, James, and John. And he took them where? They went up on the mountain to pray. This is different in Luke. Significant things happen in Luke while Jesus is praying. Baptism, the advent of the Holy Spirit, happens while Jesus is praying. It's the importance of prayer. And then in verse 29, and while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, which is what happens to Moses on the mountain, and his clothes become a dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. I've always wondered how they knew it was Moses and Elijah. Did they have name tags? Had they seen, pictures? This is not, we don't have photos. How do they know it's Moses and Elijah? Do they have little signs that were like law and the prophets? We represent law and the prophets. Did he introduce them to them? Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure. The word in Greek is also the word used for Exodus. They were speaking of Jesus' Exodus, which is the great miracle of the Old Testament, the Exodus. And so now we have Jesus' Exodus that will be life-saving as well. They were speaking of his Exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. Do you remember that happens at a different time in the Gospels? Garden of Gethsemane, although it's not named as Gethsemane in Luke. It's just a garden. We know it's on the Mount of Olives. It's not named as the garden. And one of the things you'll notice for me is I tend to preach the gospel I'm in. You don't see me pulling a lot of different scriptures when I preach. Did you ever notice that? Some pastors will pull, 6 or 7 different scriptures. I tend to live in the scripture that I've been given as opposed to going to different scriptures to prove my point. I try to live in that particular scripture for that Sunday. They were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, it's interesting. They were sleepy, but they didn't sleep this time. They saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And just as they were leaving him, Peter says to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Turn and tell your neighbor, it's good for us to be here. And then Peter has the edifice complex, I like to call it. He decides in order to hold on to this moment, we have to build something. We have to build something and hold on to this moment. It's not enough just to experience the glory. We need to hold on to something. And some people have critiqued Peter because he makes 3 dwellings and tries to put Moses, Elijah, and Jesus on the same level. I'm not exactly sure of that interpretation, but I thought it was interesting. Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, or tents is really the word. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Not knowing what he said. You ever been there? You know, you said something and you had no idea what you were saying, not knowing what he said. While Peter was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. The first voice in the Gospel of Luke says, You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased, speaking directly to Jesus. This voice is not for just Jesus himself. This is for the disciples and for all of us. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent in those days, told no one of the things they had seen. I like to look at this in parallel. Has anybody ever had a gospel parallel where they looked at the gospels alongside each other to kind of compare them? And so we use the word synoptic gospels for Peter, James, and John. No, for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those 3 books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we say they're the synoptic gospels because they look at Jesus with the same eyes. And the way that it works is the Gospel of Mark is the skeleton upon which everything else is built. It's the first one written. It's written most simply. It's written in the most simple Greek of all the writers. And Matthew comes along and rewrites Mark for a Jewish audience, and Luke comes along and rewrites Mark for a Gentile audience. And you can kind of feel that in the words that are spoken, the words that are there. So you can see some of the differences. So we think that Luke had Mark as a basis, but made certain editorial decisions as he was retelling the story. So you can see some of the differences. Instead of 6 days, it's 8 days, okay? It could be that the resurrection takes place on the 8th day, the day after the Sabbath. And so that the 8th day, this is a resurrection type appearance, and this is on the 8th day. And why did they go up the mountain in Luke? To pray. Is that in the others? No, it's just in the Gospel of Luke. And then when is he transfigured? When is he changed? While he is praying. Luke wants you to know that significant things happen in the life of Jesus and can happen in our lives while we are praying. And they appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure that he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. It only talks about that Exodus there in Luke. And then we look at another parable. Then we look at another parallel. And then this part about being weighed down with sleep is only in Luke. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw the glory, and the 2 men stood with them. And then this terrible line about Peter not knowing what he said is also only in Luke. And then we move to this last one, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud, and the fear that is upon them is there. They're told not to be afraid, and that happens a little later in the Matthean version. And this one, he says, This is my son, my chosen, as opposed to my beloved. And so you get a little bit of language difference there. And in Luke, it's interesting. They don't have to be told to keep silent. In the other Gospels, at least in Matthew, they're told not to tell anyone. But in Luke, they just keep it to themselves because they have experienced something amazing. And then they get back down to base camp. They get back down to the bottom of the mountain. And there at the bottom of the mountain, the disciples who've been left behind, Thomas and Philip, are having a problem. On the next day, they came down the mountain. A great crowd met with him. And just then a man shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child. He's got seizures." And Jesus yells at them, saying, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you?" I probably should have preached that one as part of this. Jesus said, "What? You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." And then he cast the demon out. In the Gospel of Mark, though, it's interesting. He says, this kind can only be cast out through prayer. There's the assumption that he's already praying in the book of Luke. So it goes downhill from here. After this, Jesus healing the boy with the demon, he foretells his death again. And then the disciples start fighting on the road about who is the greatest. Then they fight about an exorcism, and Jesus says, "Do not stop them, for whoever is not against us is for us." And then they go to a village that refuses to receive Jesus, and they go on to another village. And then after that, these would-be followers of Jesus come. As they were going along the road, someone said to him, "I'll follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said, "Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." To another, he said, "Follow me." But he said, "Lord, let me first go bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury the dead." And another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say well to those at my house." And Jesus said, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." And so Jesus has set his face resolutely toward Jerusalem, and there's nothing that's going to stop him along the way. And he's calling others to that kind of discipleship as well, a faith that keeps looking forward. So I hope that you will think and ponder the Transfiguration this week. And I love what some of your tables do is they share prayer concerns. So I invite you as a praying congregation to share prayer concerns. Significant things happen in Luke while we're praying. Ask the others how your praying 5 times a day is going. I think I've admitted in here before that the one that I'm having the hardest time with is praying before a meal. Not when I sit down with people, I'm good at that. But when I'm here at the church and somebody hands me a piece of pizza and I don't stop, and that's it's something I'm working on. Have you ever experienced a glimpse of heaven? Have you had a mountaintop experience? How did it impact your life? How comfortable are you talking about your death? Have you made plans for your funeral, your burial, your legacy? And I'll be talking about that Sunday because my family makes fun of the way I say burial or buried and not buried. So, and then finally, what will you turn your face toward for Lent? What might you need to turn away from in order to do that? Discuss among yourselves.